Well, hello everyone. My name is Jim Two Crows Wallen, and since this is March, I wanted to share some stories today with you about some very important women in Missouri history. And the first lady I want to talk about today, her name was Olive, and she married Nathan Boone, Daniel Boone's youngest son, in 1799 in late September. In October the 1st, they moved, taking what few possessions they had. You see, when they got married, Olive was 16 and Nathan was 18. So they started out very young, headed for Upper Louisiana Territory, or what would become the state of Missouri. They made their way to St. Louis, and they traded a horse, a saddle, and a bridle for 640 acres of land. And they went farther west to what would become St. Charles, and went 20 miles north of St. Charles and made their homestead. It was wintertime was coming on. It was late October before they had got to St. Louis, and wintertime was coming on, so they had to make a shelter, and they made it out of brush and hides. And they survived the winter that way. In the spring, Nathan built a log cabin, and it just had a dirt floor. And in the spring rains, when it would rain hard, water would seep through the roof, and there would be several inches of standing water in the cabin, just muddy mess. So Olive took her servant girl, and they went out and they took down some elm bark. And they brought it back in. They put poles down. They cut from limbs, and they put those poles down, and then they covered it over with this elm bark. And it made a nice floor. They put it with the bark side up so it wouldn't roll up or wouldn't curl up, and they made a nice floor that way. Well, Nathan had taken off to hunt with his dad, and they'd been gone several days, when Olive knew that she needed a sieve, and she didn't have one, so she had to make one. She went out and got some hickory bark, made it into a circle, tanned a deer hide, and put that deer hide, stretched it over the circle, and made it into a funnel shape and sewed it up. Then she took a wire, heated it in the fireplace, and poked holes through the leather, and it made a great sieve. Well, Nathan had bought her a loom, but there wasn't really room for it in the cabin, but he had also built a kind of a storage building. And so she went out, looked it over, decided that would probably work, but it had no fireplace and it wasn't heated, so it'd be too cold to work in there in the wintertime. So she had her servant girl go to the next neighbor a mile away. And she brought back a cross-cut saw. And they sawed through several logs, made an opening for a fireplace. They gathered rocks and made the fireplace out of rocks. They gathered sticks and made the chimney. When Nathan got home, he said that fireplace drew better than any other fireplace on the whole their whole homestead. So Nathan back out hunting again, and this time when he's out hunting, he's again with his dad. And Olive has to prepare everything. She has to take care of the farm. She has to take care of the livestock. And so it seemed like she was always doing that. And Daniel would come home, or Nathan would come home sometimes with Daniel, sometimes go out by himself. All the time she was raising 14 children, one of whom died at childbirth. And so she had to take care of everything. Eventually, when they were in their 50s, they built, well, before that, they left the log cabin, moved to about where Defiance, Missouri is today, and built a 4-story stone house. And Daniel had came to live with them at that time, and Daniel always kept a cherry coffin carved out of cherry wood under his bed that he had made himself. And it was said that every once in a while he'd slide it out from underneath his bed and lay down in it to see if it still fit. So Daniel passed away while he was there with Olive and Nathan. And he's buried in just kind of between Marthasville and Defiance, Missouri today. Olive and Nathan, when they were in their 50s, they sold the 4-story stone house and they moved to Greene County, Missouri, where they lived out the rest of their days surrounded by their children. And they were buried, when they both passed away, they were buried in a plot on the land that they had lived in. And you can still see that today. It's Nathan Boone's homestead. And you can go there and you can visit where Olive and Nathan are buried and see the house that they lived in. And that story is simply called Olive Boone. The next story is about another pioneer woman before Missouri had become a state. Her name was Hannah Allison, and in the late 1700s, she married William Cole. And her sister Phoebe married Stephen Cole. So brothers married sisters. And they had heard about the Boones. Now the Coles, they were cousins of the Boones. And they had heard about Nathan Boone and his salt slick that he had found and was shipping salt back to St. Louis. So they decided they would make their way into that area. And they left. They made their way to a little island in the Missouri River, very close to where Hermann, Missouri is today. And they spent a couple of years on that island. Well, one night, the Sauk and Potawatomi Indians came and they stole 7 of their horses. And so the men, including the 2 Cole brothers, decided they would track them down and get their horses back. So 2 nights later, while they were asleep, they were attacked by these same Indians. William was killed almost immediately. Stephen, it was said that he killed 4 of the Indians and wounded a 5th one. And he was able to escape, but when he got back, he had 26 wounds throughout his body. Well, they decided they were going to go even farther west. They were going to try to make it to where that salt lick was. And a man by the name of Benjamin Cooper took several families. They made their way across the river and headed towards what would become the town of Booneville. When they got there, it was December. It was cold. And many of them stopped on the north side of the river about where Booneville is today. And they made their homesteads there. But the Coles went just a little farther on, and they crossed the river going to the south of Booneville. And so they had to make them a primitive shelter, and they built it out of logs and scraps of wood and covered it with hides, and they made it through the winter that way. In the spring, Hannah had 9 children, and she was a widow now, as her husband had been killed in that Indian attack. And so Hannah, she decided that they were going to do the best they could with her and her 9 children. They weren't going to go back. And so they built a log cabin. Now, Stephen was the youngest of the 9 children. And Stephen was very helpful. He would go out and he would hunt. And he would kill, it was said in one 4-day period, he killed 23 bears. He would often hunt turkeys and bear and elk and buffalo, all still in that area today that we call Booneville. And so he's out hunting. Hannah's taking care of all of the, getting the farm all set up, taking care of the livestock and everything. Well, when spring came, they had to leave their wagon. They had taken a wagon with their supplies in it, and they had to wait till spring because there was so much ice in the river, they couldn't cross the river. So they had very little to eat. Samuel killed a wild turkey. Otherwise, they were eating slippery bark, slippery elm bark, and just getting water from the river. So finally, the river is down enough and the ice is melted that they go back across the river to the north side, and they have a pirogue, a small boat, and they have to bring the supplies over several trips, and they had to take the wagon apart because it wouldn't fit on the pirogue. So they took it apart, brought it across, and reassembled the wagon there. In 1810, there was a Indian attack. And so Hannah and her 9 children, they made their way across the river. They had confiscated a keelboat with a French fur trapper that was going up the river. And they all got on that keelboat and made their way across to Fort Kincaid. It was a fort that was built, but it wasn't a very advantageous place. In fact, in the summer of that year, it was surrounded by 400 Indians at one time. Well, finally things kind of settled down, and Hannah went back to her cabin, but she called all of the people. There were now more people living on the south side, and she called all those people together in her house, and they decided they would build a fort on the bluff overlooking the river where they would have a good vantage point of anybody coming to attack them. And so the fort was built in a week, and it was called Fort Hannah. And at Fort Hannah, anytime there was some uprising, the people would all run to that fort, because the Indians, it was during the War of 1812, and the Indians were still attacking. They had associated themselves with the British. But by 1814, things had kind of settled down. And because they had settled down, there was no need for that fort as a place to run to be safe. But they still used that fort. Hannah gathered everybody together, and they made it a post office. It supplied as a hospital, and many other uses. Elections were held at that fort. Whenever there was an election, they would go there to vote. So this fort became very important even after the War of 1812 was over with. And by now, the Indians had decided they couldn't defeat the settlers, and they moved farther west. Well, Hannah kept on. As she got older, the children would have to take care of her. And so she always lived right around her children. And she was very important. Church services, they would come to her house or to the fort, and church services would be held. Hannah eventually died, and she became known as the pioneer mother of Missouri, because she came at a very early time when no other white woman had come into that area and did all the things that she did. The story is simply called Hannah Cole. The next story I want to share with you, we're going to move along in time a little bit to the time of the Civil War. There was a little girl who was born who was named Cathay Williams. And Cathay, her mother was a slave, but her daddy was a freed man. But because the mother was a slave, that meant that Cathay was born as a slave as well. And so as she grew up, she was born in 1844 in Independence, Missouri. And as she grew up, her master had taken all of his people and moved to Jefferson City and was running a plantation in Jefferson City, and he passed away. Well, in 1861, when the war started, the U.S. military controlled Jefferson City for a short period of time. And while they were there, they rounded up all of the slaves and they called them contraband. And contraband were forced into service to help the U.S. Army. Now, they didn't fight in battles, but they did things like build roads, cook food, laundresses, ladies that would do the laundry, and nurses. So Cathay was put in a regiment and eventually wound up with General Sheridan. And she was a washerwoman and a cook. And when she was first taken into contraband, they said, "We want you to cook for the staff." And she says, "I don't know how to cook. I've always just been a house girl. I've never cooked before." Well, they went to Little Rock, Arkansas, and at Little Rock she learned how to cook, and that's why she became to Philip Sheridan. That's the reason she became attached to that group, and she did laundry and cooking for his staff. And she saw many battles. Not that she fought in them, but she was behind the scenes, but she saw many battles, the Red River Campaign, and many other battles that she saw. She was at the Battle of Pea Ridge, Arkansas. So from there, they started going farther south, and she was in many different locations in the south until finally the war was over. And she didn't have any options, really, because the only thing that she could do as a freed woman now was either laundry or cooking for someone. That's what she knew. So she went to a fort in New Mexico, and she became the cook for the men at the post. Well, in 1866, she thought, "I'm just a young girl still. Maybe I can fool the army." And so she signed up as William Cathay, changed her name, and dressed as a soldier. The doctors examined her, but back then they didn't do a thorough examination like they do today. And so she wasn't discovered. And she went with them. She wasn't there very long when she got smallpox. She was sent to the hospital, but they still didn't find out that she was a woman. As soon as she recouped enough, she went back to New Mexico to be with her group, her regiment. And again, it wasn't long before she got sick again. And this time when she went to the hospital, the doctors discovered she was a woman. So she was told that she would have to leave the army. In fact, the men in her regiment wanted her out of there quick. And so the regiment that she had belonged to was the 38th, and she would eventually become known as the only woman to serve as a Buffalo soldier, because the 38th became part of the Buffalo Soldiers. And she was the only known woman to serve as a Buffalo soldier. But her health just kept deteriorating. She would go into the hospital. She had neuralgia. She had diabetes. She was almost deaf. And she had all 10 of her toes were amputated because of the diabetes. And so she always walked with a crutch after that. Well, after she was released from the army, she made her way to Pueblo, Colorado, where her mother was running an orphanage. And she stayed there and she got married. And it didn't last very long. It wasn't a very successful marriage because the man that she married stole her team of horses and wagon and all of her money and took off. Well, she filed suit against him. He was eventually caught and had to give back the team of horses and her wagon and what little money. He'd spent most of the money, so she didn't get any money out of the deal. But from then on, she stayed unmarried the rest of her life. About 1889 or 1898, somewhere in that time period, she was back in the hospital again, and this time she applied for a pension because she had served not in the Civil War, it was after the Civil War, she'd served with the Indian Wars. And the doctor examined her and turned her down for a pension. And it was said that she probably died shortly after that in an unknown grave. Nobody knows where she's buried today. But Cathay Williams was the only known woman to serve during the Indian Wars. There were over 400 women that actually dressed as men during the Civil War. But she's the only one that was in the Indian Wars and that unit became part of the Buffalo Soldiers. Her name was Cathay Williams. The next story I want to share with you is called Mercy and the Berry Sisters. Alice Berry was born in 1850. We're moving on in time now. And her sister, Catherine, was born 8 years later. When Catherine was 3 years old, their mother died. And their father continued to raise the girls. He sent them to school so that they got an education. That was uncommon at that time for girls to go to school. But he sent them to school. And in fact, he said, you must always take care of your fellow people around you, your neighbors. It's your responsibility to help people. And so Alice, after she finished her schooling, she began to teach school. And she sent Catherine to medical school. And Catherine became a surgeon. After Catherine became a surgeon, she would use the money that she made and sent her sister Alice to dentistry school. So they became a dentist and a surgeon. But they decided they needed to move someplace west. They were born in Pennsylvania, but they needed to go west. They thought that's where the need would be. And so they wrote down a list of cities and then flipped a coin, and wherever that coin landed, that's where they would go. The coin landed on La Crosse, Wisconsin. And so the sisters moved there. Now they had both married. Both sisters had married while they were in school. But both of their husbands died prematurely. And so they were left as widows. And for some reason, in the 1890s, they moved from La Crosse, Wisconsin to Kansas City, Missouri. And when they got here, they tried to set up their practices. But there were no women doctors, no women dentists at that time in Kansas City. And all of the established groups that these people belonged to, the doctors and the dentists belonged to, would not refer a patient to any woman. And so Alice set up all of her dentist equipment in the living room of her home. And she would take care of patients that the other dentists wouldn't take care of. Catherine, she did not have an office space, so she would go around to the neighbors and tend to the ones who were sick. About this time, a barkeeper from Westport came to the sisters and said, look, there's this woman who has this daughter who's very, very sick. And she wants to give that daughter away to somebody that can take care of her. Well, the next evening, Alice was walking home, and she finds this 5-year-old girl who's crippled, and she is very, very ill. So she picks her up, carries her home, and the sisters know she's got to go to a hospital someplace, or else she's not going to make it. And so they look around, and finally they rent a bed in a maternity hospital. And the two sisters nurtured this girl back to health. Well, the sisters became known then as people who would take care of children. Now, Alice's specialty was just being a dentist. Catherine's specialty, she was a surgeon. And she would talk to the other doctors and try to convince them to go into pediatrics. Pediatrics was something very new and uncommon, the taking care of children. And so they were known as people who would, the doctor and the dentist, they were known as people who would take care of the downtrodden. And so eventually this maternity hospital folded. It went bankrupt. And Alice and Catherine leased the building. It was just a dilapidated old house, but it was a place they could set up beds. It held 27 beds, and it was always a waiting list to get into the hospital because there were so many. This was during Depression times, and there were so many people that were late 1890s. There was a severe depression, and there were so many people that couldn't afford it, but yet Catherine and Alice would take care of them, doctor them back to health, fix their teeth, whatever needed to be done. And so that hospital, they called it the Hospital for Crippled, Diseased, and Ruptured Children. Well, they also were involved with this women's group called the Mercy Band. And so Alice one day went to their meeting. Both of the ladies belonged to this group. And they said, "We would like to use your name for our hospital, for the name of our hospital." And the Mercy Band people said, "That would be awesome. We would love to have our name associated with your hospital." So it became known as Mercy Hospital. Well, they were outgrowing it, and there were over hundreds of women's groups that actually did fundraisers. And Alice would speak. Alice was the one, she took care of the business end of things, while Catherine took more care of the patients. And so more and more people got involved, and Alice kept talking to different groups, and these groups would raise funds until finally they were able to move from that old dilapidated old maternity hospital into another hospital facility along what would become known today as Truman Road. And so while they were there, more and more money kept coming in. So they set up a school for nurses to be trained in pediatrics. And they also set up a doctor's course where they would train the doctors. Catherine was known for her surgical abilities. She was one of the best in the region, and she was known for taking care of cleft lips and cleft palates. And so she would talk to the other surgeons and try to get them involved in pediatrics, and sometimes some of them would come and volunteer help for them. But still, there was always an overflow. And finally, they raised enough money. Well, while they were there at that second hospital, every day, Catherine would go out and she would put a blackboard on the sidewalk, and she would list items that they needed, like milk or bread or clothing or socks, whatever it was they were in desperate need of, and people would bring those items to the hospital. In 1913, Alice died. And Catherine took over. She went around speaking at the groups, continuing trying to get the doctors and nurses. The nurses that they had trained, they actually had a code of ethics that those nurses had to follow. And they designed their uniforms, and they got Florence Nightingale to design the cap that they wore on their heads. Well, in 1933, Catherine died. By now, they'd already moved to the hospital that you know today, and of course, it became known as Children's Mercy Hospital. And today, there are over 460 locations, and they have 2 beds, and 460,000 patients see Children's Mercy Hospital or their outlying areas each year. The story is called Mercy and the Berry sisters. We're going to continue to move along in time, and this time we're going to come up to more modern times of Missouri history. This story is called The Kidnapping of Nell Donnelly. In 1931, Nell Donnelly was taken prisoner by two thugs who wanted to ransom her. Nell Donnelly had started a dress company and became famous in no time at all. Her company just kept growing and expanding. She had many people working for her as seamstresses, and her business became known as Nellie Don's. And so they had captured Nellie and her chauffeur, and they called her husband Phil and said, if you contact the police or you do not pay us $75,000 in ransom, we are going to blind your wife and kill the chauffeur. Well, Phil Donnelly didn't go to the police. He went to a person he knew by the name of James A. Reed. And James Reed was a politician, a Democratic politician, who was very involved with the Pendergast regime. And so James A. Reed went to a local thug that he knew that was also acquainted with the Pendergast machine and told him, find Nell and the chauffeur. 2 days later, they had found Nell and the chauffeur and rescued both of them unharmed. In the meantime, Nell went back to her business, creating the fashions that are still popular today. You will see people that talk about Nellie Don and collect the dresses that she made. And so when she went back to her dressmaking, a year after the kidnapping, she divorced her husband, Phil. And she split the company assets and bought out Phil for $1 million, which was a lot of money back in those days. And one of the reasons they said that the divorce happened was because James A. Reed, being a close friend to the family, it was found out that Nell's son was actually, the father was James A. Reed and not Phil Donnelly. So after she divorced him, 2 years later, she married James A. Reed. And they say that Nellie Don lived a happy life the rest of her life. And when she passed away, it was a big thing in the Kansas City area. People from all over, people that were politicians, just the run-of-the-mill ordinary people, came to her funeral. And Nellie Don had lived out the rest of her days. The story is called The Kidnapping of Nell Donnelly. Now, if you have been interested in the stories that I've shared today about these women in Missouri history, I've just barely scratched the surface. There are thousands of people, women in Missouri, that became a very integral part of our history. And do you know where you can find those stories? Right here in the Mid-Continent Public Library. There's a whole section on Missouri history. And you can find about all kinds of exciting women. I will tell you one last little snippet. My wife, her mother worked in the same beauty shop that Bess Truman went to. Now, Bess, my mother-in-law didn't do Bess's hair, but she was in that same beauty shop. And one day they were in the beauty shop, and one of the ladies that was sitting in one of the chairs leaned over to Bess and said, "Can't you get your husband to quit saying manure?" She said, "Honey, if you only knew how long it took me to get him to say manure." Also, Harry was known for his walks, and he would walk the streets of Independence where they lived. And once in a while, he would get in his 1952 Chevy business coupe. This was after he was president and he came back to Independence. And he would back it out of the driveway and drive it down what today is called Truman Road. Back then it was 15th Street. And once in a while, because his eyesight was so bad, he would sideswipe a car. And the Secret Service men would go along behind him and put a little card on the window where they could go and get their car fixed. And so there's all kinds of fascinating things that happened here in our state. And like I say, I just barely scratched the surface today. But my name is Jim Two Crows Wallen, and I appreciate you watching. Thank you.